Good day, my name is Julia Sікаленко. I'm a student of the 62nd group 10th grade specialized primary school gymnasium named after the hero of Ukraine Sергія, Mihайловича, Bонdarchuk, and the topic of our project is Comparative Linguistic Analysis of Contemporary English Language for Poetry in Ukraine based on DUFFY'S testimony and ARMITAGE'S rate. Poetry continues to serve as a vital medium for processing conflict, bearing witness to suffering, and preserving the human experience of war. The ongoing war in Ukraine has generated significant literary response from global authors, creating a diverse corpus of work that merits scholarly attention. This comparative study examines two prominent examples of contemporary English language poetry about the Ukraine war, focusing on their contrasting linguistic features and how these differences communicate wartime experience to international audiences. The research aims to expand our understanding of how war and poetic languages function in relation to contemporary conflict, particularly when authors write about wars experienced by others. In examining two distinct poetic responses to the Ukraine conflict, this study investigates questions of literary witness, empathetic language, and the role of poetry in transnational discussions of war. The object of this research are two contemporary English language poems addressing the war in Ukraine, DUFFY'S testimony and ARMITAGE'S rate, analyzed as comparative case studies. The subject of this research is the contrasting linguistic and stylistic features employed in these poems, including narrative perspective, temporal framing, lexical choices, syntactic patterns, figurative language, and imagery. The aim of this work is a comparative analysis of linguistic features and thematic elements in contemporary English language poetry addressing the war in Ukraine. The objective is simply the following tasks: to identify contrasting linguistic patterns in contemporary English language poetry about the Ukraine war, to analyze how different linguistic approaches communicate wartime experience to distant audiences, to examine the various functions of poetic language in bearing witness to contemporary conflict, to contribute to understanding of the diverse linguistic strategies in 21st century war poetry. Narrative perspective and voice. Testimony employs a consistent first-person collective voice with the anaphoric I am structure, creating an embodied identification with multiple Ukrainian perspectives. In contrast, Gheroya primarily utilizes third-person perspective, 83% of stanzas with observational distance, interrupted only by a brief first-person intrusion in stanza 4 when the speaker acknowledges the distance from events. This difference creates contrasting ethical positions. DUFFY'S poem embodies and performs collective identity. ARMITAGE'S poem acknowledges and foregrounds the act of distant witnessing. The two poems display statistically significant differences in narrative perspective type as shown in Table 1. Temporal framing. While both poems predominantly utilize present tense, they construct temporality differently. Testimony creates a timeless present through the absence of specific temporal markers. In contrast, Gheroya includes 5 specific temporal indicators. For example, at noon, in minutes, in real time, again, ninefolds. They situate the events within a specific time frame, emphasizing the contemporaneity of the conflict as shown in Table 2. Lexical density in fields. Comparative lexical analysis reveals distinct patterns shown in Table 3. Testimony foregrounds human identity through role-based nouns, for example, mother, father, teacher, doctor, journalist, while Gheroya emphasizes technological mediation through terms related to observation and communication. For example, screens, camera, phones, headlines. Metaphorical patterns. Gheroya employs significantly more metaphors related to distance and proximity. For example, warm and distant, 1,000 miles away, safe distance. Linguistically foregrounding the ethical problem of remote witnessing shown in Table 4. The comparative analysis reveals two distinct linguistic strategies for bearing witness to distant conflict. Embodied collective voice, DUFFY. Through consistent first-person narration and parallel structures, testimony linguistically performs identification with Ukrainian experience, collapsing distance through grammatical choices. Ethical distance observation, ARMITAGE. Through predominant third-person perspective and explicit acknowledgement of distance, Gheroya foregrounds the problematic positions of the distant witness, making mediation part of its subject. The poems construct the temporality of war differently. Ritualistic timelessness, DUFFY. The absence of specific temporal markers in testimony creates a mythic ritual quality that positions the conflict within historical continuity. Documented immediacy, ARMITAGE. The specific temporal markers in Gheroya emphasize the real-time nature of the conflict, positioning it as contemporary crisis rather than a historical pattern. This suggests that while both approaches are common in contemporary war poetry, the distance observational stance remains slightly more prevalent, potentially reflecting ethical concerns about appropriation of experience. This comparative analysis demonstrates how contemporary English language poetry about the Ukraine war employs contrasting linguistic strategies to navigate the ethical complexities of bearing witness to distant conflict. DUFFY'S testimony and ARMITAGE'S rate represent two distinct approaches to this challenge. DUFFY'S poem employs a collective first-person voice, parallel syntactic structures, and identity-based lexis to create a poetics of embodiment and identification. This approach linguistically performs solidarity through grammatical choices that collapse distance between speaker and subject. subject. In contrast, Armitage's poem utilizes predominant third-person perspective, fragmented syntax, and technology-mediated lexis to create the poetics of ethical distance. This approach foregrounds the problematic positions of the distant witness, making the act of observation part of the poem's subject. These findings contribute to our understanding of how poetry functions in relation to contemporary conflict, suggesting that the linguistic features of poetry reflect not only aesthetic choices, but ethical positions regarding representation of author's trauma. As the Ukraine war continues, these poetic responses constitute an important corpus for understanding how language negotiates the ethics of distant witness. Thank you for your attention.